Anyways, what I would like to share with you today is very important to me and hopefully to the environment as well. In fact, this is one topic that I teach in the University of the Philippines, and I'm sure the alumni of UP will find it familiar. But still, it's really nice to refresh our memories, especially in this time when we are experiencing a lot of changes, not only in our city, but also with our climate. So what I'm going to share with you today hopefully will be relevant to just how we are changing our environment, and especially our climate. So, this is our home. And if you think about it, it's really amazing because this is the only planet that we have discovered so far that supports life in abundance as we know it. And to appreciate our home, it's important to understand how it works. Like, how could it sustain all this life, right? And why just here? Not in Mars, not in Venus, just this particular planet in our solar system. A big part of it is climate. And climate is the amount of heat, wind, water that we receive over time. And so far, well, until recently, our climate has been quite predictable. And that's something that helps sustain life. Imagine a climate which is really hot one minute and really cold in the next. How do you think we can adjust? I mean, kung sobrang mainit nga, kailangan natin mag-aircon. Tapos, kung sobrang malamig, kailangan natin magsuot ng jacket or something, di ba? Imagine a place so inhospitable na yun nga, it gets warm all of a sudden, gets cold all of a sudden. That's not our planet, and that's why we have life in abundance, because we can predict what happens when it's going to get cooler, when it's going to get warmer. In fact, we could divide our planet into 4 major zones, like the tropical zone, which is closer to the equator, shown in red. And then there are the drier zones, which are like the deserts, which we find in our huge land masses, which are the continents. I'll explain to you later how come there are deserts in these large places. And then we have the polar regions, which are the really cold places, which are found in the northern and southern extremes of our planet. Then we have the temperate regions, which are in between. So they have seasons which are cool, they also have seasons that are much warmer, but they have these different times of the year. We could divide our planet into these zones because our climate has so far been predictable. Well, until recently when we started experiencing El Nino, La Nina, then we have extreme weather like typhoons, so on and so forth. I mean, these have been happening before, but in recent memory, it's getting worse. And I hope this lecture will help us understand why it's getting worse and what we could do about it. So, we have to go back to the basics. Just what does affect our climate? One big factor, one big element is the sun. In fact, our climate is influenced by the amount of solar radiation that we receive. The reason why we have all these climate zones is because different parts of the world receive different amounts of sun throughout the year. So, we mentioned earlier that the tropical zone, which is the hot and humid part of our world, is located close to the equator. That's because the middle portion of our planet is what receives the most amount of sunlight. As you go further north or further south, sun comes in at an angle. And that lessens the amount of radiation that we receive in those upper and lower portions. Another reason why we have seasons is because our planet doesn't keep still. Sometimes it tilts toward the sun, sometimes it tilts away from the sun. In our case, where we are, in the summer, it tilts towards the sun. And during the rainy season, in the cooler months, it goes away. Also, where you are determines how much heat you get from the sun. If you're on the side of a terrain that's facing the sun, obviously you get more heat. When you're on the side away from the sun, you get less. I mean, this is all very basic, but when you start factoring in other elements, which I'll mention earlier, then you'll start to see the bigger picture, okay? We also receive different amounts of sunlight throughout the day. Obviously, in the morning and in the evening, we receive the least. Then we get the most sunlight at midday. Now we start to see how everything works together. Another thing that affects climate is the air. And we get different amounts of air depending where we are. The lower we are, the more air we have. The higher you get, the less air. But how does that affect anything? Well, what keeps us warm is actually the air absorbing the heat from the sun. So at lower altitudes, it gets warmer because there's more air to absorb the heat. As you get higher, there's less air, diba? The air gets thinner as you go higher. And there's less air to absorb less heat. Kaya sa Tagaytay, it feels cool because there's actually less air up there at a higher altitude. Then air also behaves differently in different places. So you could imagine air like fluid, like water. So it just flows where it's easier to go to. So when you have mountain ranges like this, the tendency of air is to flow through the valley, right? And where you are in terms of height also affects how air moves. So when you get higher, imagine that air is like water. Do you remember the saying na still waters run deep? Still waters run deep because yun nga, mas malalim yung lugar, di ba? So the same thing goes with air. The higher you go, the faster it gets. Parang water, like water in the stream. Okay? The shallower the stream, the faster the water. Then when you get down to the valleys, it gets slower. Okay? Another example, yun nga, our favorite example, Tagaytay. Okay? It's much higher. That's why you get faster wind speeds over there, kaya mas fresco. Then here in the lowlands, Metro Manila, the air feels sluggish, it's slower because we're much lower. Okay, we're almost there. Then we start to factor in how water affects the climate. In fact, water is also a very important element, as you will see. Because water comes in many forms. It comes in gaseous form, like water vapor, comes in liquid form, like what we see in the oceans, in the rivers. It also comes in solids, where you could see this in the polar regions and in temperate areas. Why is this so important? Because when water changes form, it absorbs heat, right? So when water transforms into gas, it actually absorbs a lot of heat. And when you start putting it all together, when you have landforms like this going up, as I mentioned earlier, as you go higher, it starts getting colder. When it gets colder, water starts to condense. It changes back into liquid.